Hello, welcome listeners and viewers to episode 5 of the Phoenix Cast. Once again, my name is Em Alves. I'm the Violence Prevention Education Coordinator at the Phoenix Center at Auraria, and I will let today's co-host, Megan Cullen, introduce herself.
Hi, y'all. So my name is Megan Cullen. I'm the director of the Phoenix Center. I use she, her, hers pronouns. And I'm a Jewish person. This is relevant for this continued conversation.
Yes. So on that note, that is a perfect segue to recap last week's episode. So this week's episode, we're once again continuing to unpack Unorthodox, which is a Netflix miniseries. And last week we started that conversation. So we answered the question of why didn't Esty just leave, and talked about how leaving is never as easy as it seems to people outside of the situation. Something that we didn't specifically name, but I wanted to name now, is that on average, it takes about 7 to 11 times, depending on your source, for a person to leave a harmful relationship. And that's because oftentimes, as we discussed in the episode, when you're leaving, that can be one of the most dangerous times. And typically survivors, they know their abusers best, and they know what is the safest option and when it is safest to leave. So even though people might be watching this miniseries and be like, why didn't she leave like a long time ago? It may not have been ever safe, or for her, it may not have been worth the risk of the unknown. Megan, would you agree that that kind of summarizes what we talked about?
Yeah, I think so. Absolutely. We have a corrections corner, a la My Favorite Murder. So shout out. Thanks for that languaging. So this is my correction. I said in last episode that the name Satmar comes from the rabbi that they follow. That's not true. It actually, the name Satmar comes from the location in Hungary where this sect originated prior to World War II. And while it originated prior to World War II, as I said last week, the way that it is practiced now is a reaction to World War II. So, Corrections Corner, thank you listeners for letting us know. We are not, as I said last time, we are not professional Jewish scholars. And even if we were, people make mistakes. So thanks for calling us out.
Absolutely. So I think a good way to kind of talk, to start our conversation today, which is getting into, Yankee, the character of Yankee. Is he a villain or is he a victim? And is there a clear answer? So to start that conversation, I kind of want to talk a little bit about who Yankee is. Within the series, Yankee is Esty's husband. And we see him as, I would say, kind of almost docile. He doesn't really fight against the current. And yet when he met Esty, and Esty was very honest in the series, and again, major spoiler alerts, one of their first face-to-face meetings was her saying that, that she's different, and him saying that's good. I like different. That's a little bit of background information on Yankee before we kind of get into the actual content. Megan, do you have anything to add?
I would just say, I know when we talked about it originally too, right? She says, I'm different. And that's probably the safest way she can think of to share, the fact that she is not necessarily planning to be, going to be, can be exactly the wife and mother that her community expects her to be. But it doesn't seem that there's ever a clarification on what that means, right?
And it kind of seems, and we don't get that sense later, that it ends up being the deal breaker for this relationship for Esty and Yankee.
Absolutely. You get the sense that Yankee is mad at her for not just doing what she's supposed to do, right? He's just why? Why are you making things difficult? Why are you making things hard? Just be what I was told you were going to be. Jeez,
Yeah, because in his concept, they both have really clear expectations for how marriage was supposed to work, and neither of those expectations were actually met. Mm-mm. Yankee is a product of the society that he's raised in. He benefits greatly from this society as a man with a lot of power. And I don't recall, what is his official role within the series, his job? Is that ever addressed?
I don't know that he has one, but that's not necessarily unique, right? So usually in the ultra-Orthodox communities, The men are dedicated to Torah scholarship or to Torah study. And the women are actually the ones who are responsible primarily for providing funding to the household. And the other thing that we also know about the ultra-Orthodox communities, particularly in the United States, is that they're often quite plagued by poverty, right? So they, I can find the statistics and we can put them in our description of this episode, but quite a few, a large percentage of the population in the ultra-Orthodox community in the US are reliant on government assistance because of that, like that situation, right? And I do not want to get into government assistance and like the ideological debate that goes around that at all. But I think it's important to know, right? So it's not out of the ordinary that Yankee wouldn't necessarily have a job, that his job is to go read and talk about Torah.
Right. And it makes sense too, because in their conception, there's no separation from religious life.
Right.
And so to have a secular job may not work for how their community is set up. My understanding, though, is that some Orthodox and some ultra-Orthodox communities do have certain members who take on kind of secular jobs, though their main function seems to also be like providing a difficult service to find for their community as well, like lawyers, or because I know that we talked a little bit in the memoir, and I don't remember if this was in the last episode or just in our private conversations about how Deborah was very worried about the was very ready with lawyers, right? Because she knew that the community would do everything that they could to make sure that she didn't get custody of her son.
Yeah. I don't think we talked about that in the episode, in our last podcast episode, but yeah, it is definitely something that she talks about in the memoir.
Yeah. And in the memoir too, there's also those like hints of like, even though there's these stereotypes about like what Jewish households look like, and that it like stereotypes of Jewish wealth specifically, she talks a lot about like the frugality that they live with. She talks a lot about the levels of poverty some of the members of her community live in, and kind of the assumptions of like some people view her family as richer, and those kinds of things. So I thought that was really interesting as well.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
Yeah, because it also seems like such a, it's all functioning, right? So that's very interesting how they're able to build this separate community within a place like New York. That is fascinating to me.
Yeah, it's like completely, okay. It seems from the memoir to be almost completely cut off, right? Like, not that there isn't any contact, because we see this in the first episode of the series, right? That there are other people who are not Jewish living in her building, who live in the area or whatever, but it's just because ideologically their life is so separate, like there just isn't any crossover with the rest of the, geographic community.
Right. And so that kind of brings us back to Yankee. He's been immersed in this culture in his entire life.
Yeah.
And I feel that we've talked a little bit about the one-dimensionality of the show, and how it's a fictionalized version of a real person's life. And that's not, a real person's life is not necessarily palatable for an audience, right? Because there's too much nuance, there's too much choices to make. But when it comes to Yankee, I feel like the miniseries, he's the only character that we are asked to make a choice about almost. Yeah, so you agree with that then?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, so, and we've talked about this a little bit, right? Like, just simply based on the realities of creating a series, whether it's a mini series or it is a longer series, you can't get into the nuance, right? It's one of the reasons, like when we start talking about media literacy for the rest of our job, it's one of the reasons that like stereotypes and myths show up so often, is because they're quick and they're easy for people to understand what's going on, right? So I think they really just truncate a lot of the nuance of characters and make them a lot simpler, which makes sense. But Yankee, he's complicated. I wanted to villainize him so badly. Like, I will be completely honest with you, right? I wanted him to be this terrible, horrible person who's holding her down and all this stuff. But as the episodes went on and the series went on, I was just like, oh, like I remember texting you when we were watching it, like, oh, Yankee, you poor sweet summer flower.
Right,
No,
because he
that's not how
wants
that
to,
works.
right. It's not how it works. He wants to do better, and yet it doesn't actually end up that way.
I think that like that's the big crux of Yankee's character, right? Is I think that he so badly wants to do what is right and has no idea what right is, because he's been thrust into this situation where everything he was ever taught that was right, um, like objectively correct, is not, you know, because then you see the way that he interacts with Moisha, right?
Right.
I don't mean to jump
Absolutely.
to Moisha. There's so much more to talk about with Yankee, but I think like the juxtaposition of Yankee wanting so badly to do what is right, and then Moisha being this like sanctioned bad guy.
Right. Yeah. Like a completely approved
Yeah.
enforcer within the society who goes against all of their morality based laws.
Mm-hmm.
So like that must have just been like the biggest, like, I don't know where I am, what I'm doing here. If this is okay, then maybe I can still make this work. Not to get into the last episode, which is a heartbreaking moment for a
We'll get
variety of
there.
reasons. So one of the things I also wanted to kind of get into was like their expectations of marriage, right? So Esty very much views marriage as like her opportunity for freedom, where she's going to get a lot more power and respect and privacy than she would have otherwise ever had. And Esty in the show, to have that one dimensionality, she's kind of seen as like very timid until she gets married to Yankee, right? But we know from the memoir, which Megan and I have both read, that that's not actually true. Deborah, who is the real version of Esty, was pretty rebellious as a kid.
Oh yeah, she's a rebel.
Right. So we don't see that part of Esty until like the actual marriage, right? So that kind of allows us to see how that works, right? Like her expectation is she's going to have all this privacy, that she's going to have this freedom, she's going to have a sex life that is only hers and her husband's and doesn't involve anyone else.
Imagine.
Right, yeah. Things that folks normally expect in marriages, although I know that across cultures that's not always true. And then we find out that Yankee and Esty are having sexual difficulties because Esty has been diagnosed with vaginismus. It's unclear whether this is a physical ailment for Esty. For some folks, it is physical. For some folks, it is mental. And for a lot of folks, it's the combination of the two. But so that is information that Esty is given by a member of the community. She's like this role of like a sex ed teacher. And you said something interesting yesterday when we were planning about how you thought she was like the stand-in for the bridal classes. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so they're called Kala classes. So Kala is bride in Hebrew, I believe, though possibly also Yiddish. And they, like, when you get engaged, you go to Kala class. And I would imagine that the class size, so to speak, is dependent on how many people are engaged at that moment. So it could very well be a like one-on-one tutoring type situation, or it could be more of a classroom setting. So I think that this particular person is that stand-in for those classes where they are suddenly like thrust into knowledge about sex, about their bodies, about like what's expected of them outside of what everybody already knows about being a wife and a mother in this society. There's more, and they have to learn that. And I think the expectation is that like, well, they're going to go to this class and then they're going to go be married and they're going to be perfect. And there's nothing that the marriage actually has to work on, which is interesting.
Right. And then once it becomes that you're not doing your job, that you're not doing what, and I keep coming back to that line that Esty talks about, that Esty says of like, God asked too much of me. Every time I think about like Esty not doing what she's like, the heaviest air quotes in the world, doing not what she's like, doing what she's not supposed to do.
Right.
So she spent her entire childhood probably idealizing marriage and viewing this as an opportunity to gain some power, and then finding out that she's still not good enough and that she still doesn't have the freedom. And not only she doesn't have freedom, but that her husband is actively talking to his mother about their sex life and saying that there's something wrong with Esty because the brothers, their wives never experienced this.
Which we don't necessarily know.
Right. Because also,
right?
like, if it's such a shameful thing, why would they tell anyone?
Mm-hmm. I don't know that they do, right? And I think that we talked about this too, when it comes down to her actually being diagnosed with vaginismus, she's given like a dilator kit, which is a series of essentially dildos increasing in size, medical grade, whatever, to help basically stretch that muscle, right? Which again doesn't address the mental, emotional, psychological component at all, and is probably why it continues to hurt when she is doing the dilation, right? Is that there isn't necessarily that component added on. But clearly, like, this is an issue that shows up for plenty of people because there was an almost immediate response to deal with it.
Right. A whole formalized role, someone who hand delivered those medical grade dildos, and also I'm assuming there was some sort of instruction, right? It takes a long time to deal with vaginismus. That's why the dilations tend to like go up very slowly, and you're working with them like for weeks at a time.
Yeah.
And we know ultimately that Esty didn't actually get that time to become more comfortable with her own body.
Yeah. I mean, when the Kala teacher tells her that that her like urethra and her vagina are two different things, she's like, I'm sorry, what? Like, even that is just like a complete surprise to her, right? And now we're suddenly like, oh, by the way, there's a problem with it and you need to fix it and it's your fault.
Right. And I gotta say, that was one of the most, for someone who grew up Catholic, that was a very relatable moment. I can't tell you how many people, like, I grew up with, who also grew up in the Catholic congregation, who, like, they found out that, like, you had a vagina and a urethra, and they were like, what? And, like, they don't believe you.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that's something that, again, that's another cross-cultural experience, I think. Across the board, especially like people who are assigned female at birth, they're taught that their bodies are not something that you ever get to know outside of like their God-given purpose.
Yeah.
Quote unquote.
Oh yeah. Super air quotes. We should just call this episode Super Air Quotes.
That's the name of my new punk band.
Love it. It's perfect.
Awesome. So, I mean, so in all of this, like, how are we viewing Yankee, like, at this point when Yankee's talking to his mom in such explicit detail?
Yeah.
Right? So, like, it's like you become a wife and then you're supposed to be, like, prioritized, but if you're not doing your job, you're kind of still out of the way, and then it seems as if that gives your mother more power because they still have to, like, fix this situation, right? Because mothers are typically pretty involved in the matchmaking process. Yeah. From what we see in the series.
Absolutely. The matchmaker ultimately like makes the match, and I'm trying very hard not to break into Fiddler on the Roof right now. So the matchmaker is responsible for that actual situation, but the families pay, right, the matchmaker to do that. And the mother is often the one that's most involved in that. If you think about it, the father is busy studying Torah. Mom is really, her domain is the household, and this is part of the household.
Right. So in Esty gaining power but then losing it because she was not able to consummate it, the mother regained more power that should have actually gone to Esty, if I'm understanding the power dynamics of the specific community instead of families.
Yes, I think so.
So in all of this, do we like Yankee? I mean, like, because to me it becomes so unclear when we get to that Berlin, like that traveling to Berlin, and you mentioned this earlier. Do you want to talk about that phone scene? Because that is just like the sweetest moment.
It is, and I think that for me, like, is really one of the things that solidified the, like, oh, he's not bad. Like, he's not just bad, right? Like, he is responsible for his choices and his actions, because people remain responsible for their choices and the actions, regardless of the context in which, you know, they make sense. Yeah. Well, and I think that goes back to this conversation we were just having about like him wanting to do what's right, but doesn't know what is right, because what is right has always served him. Like he is he is like the mold of the person who has the most privilege in that society. He's a man. Yeah, that's it. He's a man. Right? And he follows the rules. Because the rules serve him, because they don't harm him in any way.
Right.
Like what's in this very specific instance, and I want to be very clear about that, because we also know like men are not necessarily across the board safe in this society, that there are plenty of men who have been very brave and come forward and shared the fact that they had experienced abuse and that they had experienced sexual assault and things like that. So I want to be clear that I'm speaking specifically about Yankee in this moment, and the fact that he, in his particular context, was very privileged and pretty much had everything and had no reason to challenge his privilege ever.
He's a married man who now has a baby on the way, and that's what you do in this society, is like, oh, you did it, great, make more. Yeah. And he's just like, well, my way to make more is in Berlin.
Yes.
So he cooperates with Moisha ultimately, and like we talked about earlier, Moisha is unequivocally a bad character. There's no moral ambiguity when it comes to Moisha. He's the enforcer, and he gets a free pass on all of the moral laws that he has to live by, because it's almost like a justification of like, well, I need to do these bad things, otherwise my people are doomed, but I'm doing this bad thing, so I'm going directly against Jewish law, and the logic doesn't actually follow. That's how men are able to maintain power here.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think you also like he's not just doing it like because he has some like deep belief in the community and wants to protect it. That while there may be a piece of that, like you also see, he's doing this because the rabbi is going to pay off all of his debts from his gambling addiction, which is heavily hinted at, but is not necessarily stated specifically.
And his wife won't talk to him. His wife won't talk to him. Which has got to be a big deal in that community, right? So like we know that Moisha has messed up in a really, really big way for him to be the person outside of the community having to do this to get back into it.
Yes, exactly. Right. So you also have that like self-serving, like he's selfish. He's a bad person. When you have Yankee, who you have to make a choice about, and then you have a like super one-dimensionalized character like Moisha, it's almost refreshing, because you're just like, yes, you are bad. Got it.
I can hate you and not have to think about it. That's fair.
Well, I think it's important when we're talking about Moisha to also talk about the fact that Moisha as a character doesn't exist in real life or in the memoir. Moisha as a character in the series, I believe, and I think you agree with me, represents the systemic abuse and represents like Este's greatest fears, which are maybe enacted, or what we see in the memoir is that those fears come to life in some ways in much more subtle ways, as opposed to like there's this one bad dude that's out to get you.
Right. Yeah. And I thought that was so interesting, because what we find out is like, yes, exactly. There are all these small instances of violence throughout Deborah's life. Like I think about her cousin, literally named Moisha in the book, and wondering like, was he attempted to assault her? I kind of think that maybe the choice to use that cousin's name as like the clearly bad, clearly immoral character wasn't a coincidence, even though it is a heavily fictionalized version of Deborah's life.
No, I think that's a really great point. So I think Moisha in the series is just a really interesting character insofar as he represents that systemic abuse. And these are very real fears, right? Like I was watching One of Us on Netflix, which is a documentary about folks who choose to leave the ultra-Orthodox community in New York. And this one of the women that it follows, she has, I believe, 7 children, and she leaves her husband because he is abusive, and she's fighting for her kids in the court, and the court actually awards her children to her husband because of the lawyers that the community is able to hire. And in fact, I don't think I mentioned this when I was talking about this yesterday, they sent out a letter to the community in Williamsburg saying like, we must protect these children, give us money for lawyers. And like the entire community, I mean, you think about it, that's all you know. You're just like, of course,
Right.
yes, obviously. The entire community is now banded together against this one woman who's trying to flee domestic violence with her children. And she's unable to do so. I haven't finished it, to be fair, but to that moment, she's unable to do so because of the might and the power of the community itself. So Estee's fear is very real.
Absolutely. And I think that it makes sense why in this version of Deborah's life, at this point, they, rather than have a toddler, you know, because that's realistically, I think Deborah's son was like 5 or 6 when she actually left.
Yeah, 4 to 6, somewhere in there.
Yeah, somewhere in there, like basically like a large toddler.
Sorry, I think we call that a child.
I'm not a child development expert. I will be very open about that. You know, it's an easier story to tell when it's a child who has just been conceived that Esty clearly wants, and flees to a place where she has citizenship and where American courts can't have the same impact that they would if she were to stay in Williamsburg. So it makes sense that that is a very real fear and that this is something that often happens. So in all of that, we kind of agree, we kind of don't agree, but we have different points and different concerns. But for you, is Yankee, is he a villain or is he just a victim in all of this?
I don't think it's either. Like, I think it's both. I think he is, like I said before, I think he is responsible for his actions as a human being who enacts harm against another person. We don't see this, but I do think that there is some level of ability of the husband to say, no, we're not going after her. Like, this is to put his foot down in that way, to use his privilege for good, if you will, right? To say, like, we're not going after her. We're staying put. We can excommunicate her and treat her like she's dead, whatever, I'll remarry, but we're not doing this. Like, he, in theory, had that ability and didn't take it. And that's a problem. And he also, like, I think he chooses ignorance because he doesn't want to get rid of his privilege, right? And we see that, like, much more specifically in episode 3, which we're going to talk about next week. Stay tuned. Don't know why I did that. But, you know, he just actively ignores asking questions about his wife or knowing anything about her to help her. And I think that that's a problem. And I think that his position in the society and his privilege are such that it is rational and reasonable that he acts the way he does. So I think it's both.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, I think that's where I land mostly as well. Like, I think I'm a little more okay with kind of hating Yankee than you are.
Sure.
But that's also because I'm always looking for someone to hate in the TV show.
Moisha wasn't good enough. Like,
I like to spread it around.
Fair. Mm-hmm.
But I absolutely agree. Like, he is accountable for his actions. He is. And he is a cog in this machine. And towards the end,
I wanted to villainize him so badly. Like, I will be completely honest with you, right? I wanted him to be this terrible, horrible person who's holding her down and all this stuff. But as the episodes went on and the series went on, I was just like, oh. Like, I remember texting you when we were watching it, like, oh, Yankee, you poor sweet summer flower.
right?
No, that's not how that works.
Right. It's not how it works. He wants to do better, and yet it doesn't actually end up that way. And I only mention this, I know we're not trying to get too ahead, but I only mention this because I think it brings it to a good point. In the end, he does try to get on Estee's level, to be where she is, to divest his privilege and to leave the community in some way. I don't fully understand in what way, because it was I think mostly a symbolic scene.
Yeah, we'll talk about it.
Right, we'll talk about it. But at the end of the day, it was too little too late. At the end of the day, Estee had suffered a lot of harm. Yeah. Estee felt that, again, always coming back to this just incredible line, I'm like, God expected too much of me. And Estee wasn't willing to bring her future child into that.
Yeah.
And I think there was something even that you said about Deborah, like, when her son, it's time for him to go to like that formal male schooling, like that was her tipping.
Yeshiva.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think they're very similar, right? Because in the memoir, her choice to leave is based on realizing that her son is going to be going to yeshiva. And once your son goes to yeshiva, you don't matter as much anymore. And your opinion to that child doesn't matter as much anymore, or is forced to not matter as much anymore. And she wasn't willing to see her son lost to her and lost to the growth that she was making, right? And the steps that she was taking to be a more fully realized version of herself.
Yeah.
And I think that that's very similar to, you know, it's a similar like point in time.
Yeah.
Because it is, if you want to get like heavy metaphor with it, when he enters yeshiva, it is a kind of like birth or a leaving, right? And it's similar to an actual birth in that way.
Yeah. No, and I think that makes a lot of sense, because I also think, yeah, that makes a lot of sense, I think, in the context of like Esti's story. Like Esti had also, at that point, like she had grown so much, even just in like the few days she was in Berlin. Like we had seen her take off her wig, take off her more modest clothing, and get in a lake with a bunch of strangers. Something that I'm sure was like the most nerve-wracking thing in the world for her, so outside of her norm. So she had already grown so much, and she wasn't willing to go backwards, and she wasn't willing to deny her child that potential freedom.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think ultimately we agree on it's just not that simple, and that people have dual roles. That Yankee can be a person who has perpetuated harm, and he can also be a person who has experienced a harmful environment. He can be a person who is being limited by his environment. And I think that he kind of sees that, but ultimately isn't willing to do anything beyond symbolism.
And I think that like, I wanted to villainize him so badly. Like, I will be completely honest with you, right? I wanted him to be this terrible, horrible person who's holding her down and all this stuff. But as the episodes went on and the series went on, I was just like, oh, like I remember texting you when we were watching it, like, oh, Yankee, you poor sweet summer flower.
Right, because
no, that's not how that works.
Right. It's not how it works. He wants to do better, and yet it doesn't actually end up that way.
I think we need to hold on to that, like the idea that perpetrators are not in fact one-dimensional as much as we want them to be. When we talk next week about the fact of how that child was conceived and how complex that is. I think the big question, correct me if I'm wrong, the big question we're answering in our next episode is, was that assault or was it consensual? And what's the complexity within that? And I think that we really need to remember Yankee as a multidimensional person when we talk about that.
And that we can absolutely hold space for the undeniable harm that is caused, and know that, again, product of a system. We're all products of systems, and no matter what system you're in, no matter what culture you're in, if you think it's the healthiest culture in the world, I have news, you're probably wrong. We all have things that we're constantly unlearning. All have unhealthy coping mechanisms or unhealthy power dynamics that we need to constantly unlearn.
Yeah, and unpack, and not just treat them with shame or with guilt, but with curiosity.
So thank you so much, Megan, for joining me here today. Again, I'm so excited for next week's episode, where we unpack that question of, is the conception of Esti's child assault? And I think that you and I, Megan, we agree that it is. And we're going to be getting into a lot of the more complex nuances of consent that usually really trips people up outside of our field. So stay tuned for that. Please, please, please remember that the PCA continues to remain open. If you need to reach someone 24/7, please call 303-556-2255, and you can reach an advocate immediately or set an appointment. You can also do so online. And then also keep an eye on all of our social media, Facebook and Instagram. We recently released the link for an article that our advocacy services manager, Catherine Miller, was a co-author on, around mental health awareness and COVID-19. So give that a read. We're really proud of her awesome work. Thank you, and subscribe, share, leave a 5-star review.